Today we're taking a look at 5 truly unpredictable cases filled with twists. As you listen to each, remember one thing: not everything is as it seems. In July 2008 in Duluth, Georgia, 40-year-old elementary school teacher Janai Coleman was sitting in her car, waiting to pick up her daughter after she finished work at a restaurant. Her gold Dodge was parked near a transit station. There was nothing unusual about the night, except for one thing. At some point while she waited, a man walked out of the gas station across the street. He pulled out a gun and demanded that she get out of the vehicle. What happened next isn't entirely clear. Either Janai refused to get out, or she agreed, but either way, she was shot. It pierced her heart and lung, killing her instantly. The man pulled her body out of the car before driving away. The next day, Janai's vehicle was found abandoned in Forest Park, Clayton County. Police thoroughly processed the vehicle, hoping to find any evidence that could help uncover the identity of the man who had senselessly shot and killed Janai. Lucky for investigators, they found something: a cigarette butt from under the driver's seat. It was a jackpot piece of evidence. Saliva for a DNA profile was recovered from the cigarette. There was a good chance that her killer had accidentally left behind a clue that could find him. With this, police searched the national database of convicted felons, looking for a name. Another clue was uncovered. The gas station across the street from the crime had video surveillance. Sadly, it didn't actually catch the shooting and carjacking on camera. Still, using witness descriptions of the suspect, police were able to find him on the video surveillance. A man who matched this description was also seen in the area where Janai's car was abandoned, just a few hours after she was shot. The DNA came up with a match: a man named Donald Smith, who had a prior drug-related conviction. Donald also matched the witness descriptions and the surveillance videos. Donald was arrested on February 3rd and charged with Janai's murder. But there was one huge problem. Donald denied the whole thing. This was hardly surprising. Few people actually admit their guilt right away, but even when Donald was shown the DNA evidence and the surveillance video, he was still adamant that he hadn't killed Janai. There was no denying that the man in the surveillance video looked just like him, but Donald had a different explanation. He said it wasn't him, but his twin brother. Here's the thing: identical twins have the exact same DNA profile. There's no way to tell one's DNA apart from the other. Was Donald lying? Could he have been throwing the blame on his twin brother? Police wanted to check his story, so they asked his sister and parents to identify which twin was seen in the surveillance. All three agreed with Donald's statement. It was his twin brother, Ronald Smith. After several days, Ronald was found and brought in, but the police now had one very big problem. The DNA evidence that they had thought was undeniable proof couldn't tell the brothers apart. They had to find other evidence to be sure which brother was Janai's killer. Investigators turned to fingerprint analysis, lifting prints from Janai's vehicle. The fingerprints matched Ronald Smith. As well, Ronald's cell phone records placed him at the area where Janai's car was abandoned. Donald was finally released as Ronald was charged. Eventually, Ronald admitted to it all, saying that he had shot Janai with a .357 Magnum before he stole her car. But he also said that the shooting had been an accident because the gun had a hairpin trigger. Yet when his case went to trial, Ronald had a totally different story. He said that despite his initial confession, the police once again had the wrong twin. Ronald claimed that the only reason his fingerprints were found in the vehicle were because he had helped Donald clean the car after he had been the one to shoot Janai. Despite his attempt to blame his twin, the jury didn't buy Ronald's story and sided with Donald. Ronald Smith was found guilty and sentenced to life plus 25 years in prison. The next case is one that I'm sure will leave you feeling haunted and questioning the truth. For several weeks in the fall of 1992, the community of Knox County, Tennessee was riddled with fear. Patricia Rose Anderson was missing for a week before her body was found by a hunter where it had been left under a mattress off Cahaba Lane. Cahaba Lane is known as a remote spot and can only be accessed by back roads. Anderson had been strangled and bound, and tragically, she'd been pregnant when she died. The gruesome discovery horrified the community, but it would only get worse. As investigators started looking into Anderson's death, They made another horrifying discovery, another woman's body. And then, in the brush nearby, was another. One of the women had been killed recently, but the other's remains were already decomposed. If 3 bodies weren't shocking enough, as they kept searching the area, they also found a 4th, though this one was only a skeleton. All had been strangled and were left naked. Police had stumbled upon a serial killer's dumping ground. Eventually, the 3 other bodies were identified as Patricia Johnson, Darlene Smith, and Susan Stone. Anderson had been a sex worker at the time of her death. Because of this, and the location where her body was found, investigators assumed that her killer must have been a local, because no one else would really know how to get to Cahaba Lane. One detective already had an idea of who could be involved in Anderson's death, and possibly even the other 3. The Knoxville detective Tom Presley remembered an incident where a woman who was a sex worker came to police after a man had been far too rough with her and robbed her. The woman ended up taking Presley to the exact area where the incident happened, Cahaba Lane. As Presley and the woman arrived, they realized they weren't alone. A man and a woman were already there, and the woman was naked. The man turned out to be 31-year-old Tom Husky, a divorced father of 2 who worked at the Knoxville Zoo, where he took care of the elephants. He was also the man who hurt the woman who had gone to the police seeking help. Husky was arrested. It turned out that many of the sex workers who knew of Husky had given him a nickname, the Zoo Man, because he frequently took the women behind the zoo. Many of the women said that he was mean to them and they tried to stay away from him, but some of them weren't in the financial position to turn him down. But when it came time to cooperate and build a case against Husky, all of the women refused. Why? It isn't exactly clear, but ultimately any case against him was dropped. What were the chances that there was more than one man known to frequently bring sex workers to the remote spot where Anderson was found? It seemed pretty unlikely. But this was just a theory. They needed evidence. With a search warrant that would later turn out to be flawed because it had been signed by a city judicial commissioner and not a judge, the police went to the mobile home where Husky lived with his parents. They confronted him and searched his room where they found what they were looking for. Investigators uncovered rope that they believed was similar to what was used to bind the killed women, and even jewelry that matched some that belonged to the women. It seemed like the case was solid, but that's when everything took a turn for the strange. The first interview with Husky was perfectly normal, but it wouldn't last. In another interview, the officer had to leave halfway through, and when they returned, Husky had changed. His voice and body language suddenly changed from mild-mannered to angry. He said he wasn't Tom Husky at all, but a man named Kyle. Confused, so were the investigators. The man calling himself Kyle told them, quote, "Give me a cigarette and I'll tell you everything you want to know. I hate Tommy." Kyle was Husky's alternate personality. He confessed to investigators that he assaulted, tortured, and even killed women in order to hurt Husky. Investigators thought Husky was putting on an elaborate act. He used his right hand, where Kyle used his left. Husky's facial expressions and body mannerisms would totally shift. But apparently Kyle wasn't alone. Soon Husky showed his other personalities, including an Englishman named Philip Dax, complete with an accent, and another named Timothy. Husky's multiple personalities threw a wrench in the case. At court, Husky pleaded not guilty, with his lawyer adding quickly after, not guilty by reason of insanity. The investigators thought that he was faking all of it, and they had good reason. The personality of Dax didn't emerge until after Husky had been watching a soap opera while in jail. He seemed to be based on a character from Days of Our Lives. While the trial was waiting for a court date, Husky was also charged for a series of assaults, both physical and otherwise. He was convicted in 1996, but interestingly, his multiple personalities were never brought up during these trials. His murder trial began in 1999, and prosecution sought the death penalty. Mental health experts squared off about whether or not Husky was honestly suffering from mental illness or making it up to avoid a murder charge. Those who believed he was honestly suffering from multiple personalities, or rather dissociative identity disorder, testified that Husky's condition had manifested because of childhood trauma, including assault. His ex-wife claimed that she had seen Husky's other personalities. As well, His defense argued he had a low IQ and wasn't capable of faking. They argued that Husky hadn't confessed at all, but instead it was Kyle, which technically wasn't proof. However, in contrast, other specialists testified that genuine dissociative identity disorder was extremely rare. An inmate who knew Husky claimed that he told them that after reading Sybil, a book that describes the treatment of a woman with dissociative identity disorder, he said he was going to pretend to have mental illness to avoid getting a death sentence. And in contrast to Husky's wife, his mother said that she never saw his other personalities. The whole case was convoluted, and it wasn't clear which side had more evidence. The jury struggled to come to a verdict. For 5 days they deliberated, but they didn't seem to be getting anywhere. 4 believed Husky was not guilty by reason of insanity, 5 thought he was sane and guilty, and 3 couldn't decide either way. The judge had no other choice but to declare a mistrial. Now the logical thing would be to have another trial, one which would result in a verdict one way or the other, but there were 2 problems. In 2002, it was determined that during his alleged confession, Husky had asked for a lawyer, which he wasn't given. The confession was ruled as coerced and therefore inadmissible. Then it was revealed that the warrant used to find the jewelry was flawed, which made this evidence also inadmissible. By 2005, the murder charges against Husky were dropped. Husky was already in prison, serving a sentence for the assaults and kidnapping charges, which amounts to about 64 years behind bars, meaning he won't be freed until 2056, unless, of course, he gets parole. Moving on to the next case, this story will remind you that sometimes all the facts just don't add up. In 1977, a grave in a family cemetery on Del Rio Pike in Franklin, Tennessee was disturbed, or to be more accurate, it had been vandalized. Any disruption to a grave is distressing, as most people can agree graveyards are usually a place of respect. But there was something particularly important about this grave. It was the grave of a Confederate Civil War hero named Colonel William M. Schey. If you haven't heard of Colonel Schey, his story is a remarkable one. He grew up in Williamson County, Tennessee, and had joined the 20th Tennessee in 1861, where he quickly rose through the ranks. At its creation, the 20th Tennessee Regiment was made up of 880 men, including Schey, and ended up fighting in some of the more memorable battles of the Civil War. The 20th Tennessee Regiment was fighting at the Battle of Nashville. On December 16th, Schey, alongside many of the men in his regiment, were killed. Schey was shot in the head at close range with a .58 caliber ball. Schey's grave was undisturbed for a century. The vandalism of his grave was noticed around Christmas 1977, when the Schey Mansion was undergoing restoration. Now, when I say that the grave had been vandalized, I'm sure you're imagining that it was smashed or spray painted and graffitied, but that isn't quite accurate. The police had to be called to the scene. The grave was opened, and a hole was cut in the cast iron casket where Schey had been buried. This was all disturbing, but the main reason the police were called was because a male body was found lying half out of the grave, a headless body. Also missing were both feet and one hand. The obvious answer was that Schey's grave had been smashed open, and it was his body hanging half out of the casket. But there was one big problem with this theory. The body was barely decomposed. It was mostly intact, except for the missing limbs, and still had most of its flesh. Schey had died over a century earlier. He should have been highly decomposed, or even just a skeleton, but his body was in great condition, especially because 100 years in the damp Tennessee weather would have certainly helped a corpse to completely decompose. The Williamson County Sheriff at the scene realized that the headless body had to be a recent homicide. They also concluded that the culprit must have tried to hide the evidence of their crime in an old grave where they thought no one would notice. And if the Schey Mansion hadn't been undergoing restoration at the time, they may have been right. But if this was true, then what happened to Colonel Schey's body? There was no sign of it in the grave or nearby, and whose body had been placed in his grave instead? Though the questions were obvious, the answers weren't so clear. There was a chance that Schey's body had decomposed completely, which is why his coffin was empty. But there should have still been some sort of residue left over that would indicate this, and there wasn't. The first thing investigators did was check to see if there were any missing persons report that matched the headless body, but none did. Of course, a positive identification was made all the more difficult because the corpse had no head, which led some people to believe that the victim had been decapitated in order to make it impossible to identify the body. After struggling to get anywhere with the identification themselves, the sheriff's department reached out for help from Dr. William M. Bass, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Tennessee. Bass is famously known for his Body Farm, an experiment where bodies were buried underground to study the stages of human decomposition. As Bass began his examination, he first stated that the body found in Shy's grave had been dead for about 6 to 12 months. Some of the flesh was pink, and the intestines were still identifiable, but even upon close examination, there was no sign of what killed the man. Bass determined that the body belonged to a victim in his mid to late 20s and was probably about 5'9" to 6 feet tall. All of this information would hopefully help narrow down who the body belonged to. But there was more. Bass noticed that the clothing worn by the deceased was an older style without any labels. The pants also laced up on the sides. He tested the coat and determined that it wasn't made of any synthetic fibers. The corpse's clothing was old, like 100 years old. Had the body been dressed up in older clothing to help disguise it? Bass wanted to find more evidence, and he was lowered into the grave with someone holding onto his heels. The head was found deeper inside the coffin, along with the pieces of a tuxedo shirt, vest, coat, pants, and a white glove still on the right hand. The head looked like it had been shoved into the grave, and the assumption was that it must have fallen off the body when it was being shoved down into the coffin. Gross, right? The head had one gaping clue, a single bullet wound. Finally, it came together. The body wasn't a recent murder victim. It was Colonel William Shy, perfectly preserved 112 years after his death. So how had Shy's 100-year-old body been so well preserved that his corpse only looked like it had been dead for less than a year? There are a few reasons, one being that Shy may have been one of the first people in Nashville to be embalmed using arsenic. As well, his cast iron coffin had been airtight and didn't allow any oxygen, which kept his body from decomposing. It also kept out all the moisture and bugs. Shy's grave was likely broken into by grave robbers who were hoping to steal any goods that were buried with him, and when they broke into the casket, they let in air, which began the decomposition process that had been held off for so long. After the robbers took whatever they wanted, they tried to rebury Shy, shoving his body into the casket again. This is what dislodged his head and why the body was found lying half out of the grave. With the mystery solved, Shy's cast iron casket was kept in the Carter House Museum for visitors to come and hear the incredible story. This next case made national headlines as a high-profile scandal, but there's still a good chance you haven't heard of it and all the shocking twists. Alfred Bloomingdale, as his last name implies, was a millionaire and a man who was the longtime friend of President Reagan and a member of his kitchen cabinet. His wife, Betsy Bloomingdale, had her own high connections, as she was also one of Nancy Reagan's closest friends. But despite their high-profile lifestyles, there were secrets hidden behind the scenes. Vicki Morgan was only 17 when she met Alfred Bloomingdale in Los Angeles. The then 54-year-old Bloomingdale had handed her an $8,000 check, and so began an affair that continued on for over a decade. Vicki became a part-time model and had several minor parts in movies. As his mistress, Bloomingdale gave Vicki up to $18,000 every month. She spent her days shopping, driving expensive cars, and living in expensive areas. The exchange was that she allegedly had to take part in sadomasochistic play with Bloomingdale. They continued on this way for 12 years until Betsy discovered their sordid affair and forced her husband to end it. She made him cut off all of Vicki's money. It should be noted that at this point, Bloomingdale's health was failing as he fought cancer, and he was in the hospital. But Vicki didn't take the end of her lavish lifestyle easily. On July 8, 1982, Vicki filed a palimony lawsuit to get financial support from Bloomingdale for the rest of her life. She demanded the sum of $11 million. The lawsuit and affair made tabloid headlines. But by the end of August, Bloomingdale was dead at age 66. Still, Vicky went forward with the lawsuit, this time against his estate. She alleged that Bloomingdale had made promises to her. As soon as she filed the lawsuit, Vicky stopped working, and she soon found herself struggling to pay her bills. When the case finally went to court, the lawyers representing Bloomingdale's estate never denied that he and Vicky had an affair, which normally would imply that she would be eligible for palimony. But they argued that because of the nature of their relationship, Vicky was essentially a prostitute. The judge agreed and ruled against the palimony suit. In 1983, 30-year-old Vicky was found dead in her condo. She was found sprawled across a bed after she had been horrifically bludgeoned to death with her son's baseball bat. It seemed obvious who was behind Vicky's demise. Rumors spread that Vicky hadn't just been killed because of the suit, but because she knew secrets about the Bloomingdale family. After all, Vicky claimed that she was writing a tell-all. Her final revenge would be to share the dirty details about her affair with Bloomingdale, which would surely ruffle a few feathers if released. She'd even been meeting with agents to sell her book and movie rights to her life. One thing was clear: Vicky had a lot of secrets that people were interested in hearing. But everything wasn't as it seemed. For the 3 weeks before she died, Vicky had been living with a friend, along with her 14-year-old son Todd, in a condominium in North Hollywood. The friend was Marvin Pancoast. The two had first met back in 1979 while they were both patients at a mental health center in Cedars-Sinai Hospital. Vicky was at the Center for Depression, paid for by Bloomingdale. Pancoast, on the other hand, was there for treatments for his various diagnoses, including schizophrenia, manic depression, psychosis, and masochism. Vicky and Pancoast never dated or were lovers. In fact, Pancoast was gay. But still, Pancoast would later explain that they had their own special kind of love for each other. After 3 weeks of living together, the two were forced to move out of the condo because Vicky wasn't making payments. They were set to move on the same day that she died. Following Vicky's death, Pancoast surrendered himself to the police, confessing that he killed Vicky. He apparently made sure that it was clear that the woman he killed was Bloomingdale's mistress, the one famous in the tabloids. This twist shocked everyone who had expected her death to be related to the Bloomingdale dynasty in some way. The night Vicky died, Pancoast had waited for her to fall asleep before he turned on the water to obscure any noise so the neighbors wouldn't hear anything. Then he took Todd's baseball bat and beat her to death. His explanation about why he did it will send shivers down your spine. "I was just tired. I'd been working with her trying to get her moved. I just wanted her to go to sleep. I just wanted her to go to sleep and leave me alone that night." If this reasoning sounds callous, there's a bit more to it, though I think you'll still find it unsettling. Pancoast described living with Vicky as being her little slave because she acted like the Queen of Sheba and needled and manipulated him. He claimed that Vicky would drink heavily and take Valium every day, spending all of her time in bed, leaving him to cook for her and her son. Pancoast claimed that Vicky never did anything. "I would get her tea with her 7 lumps of sugar. I'd massage her feet and I'd comb her hair. The only time she ever moved herself was when she was manipulating somebody." He finally hit a breaking point. But there were a few things that didn't quite make sense. Pancoast's clothes didn't have any evidence of bloodstains, and there weren't any fingerprints taken at the crime scene that would prove he had done it. Still, he confessed, until he didn't. Eventually, Pancoast recanted his confession and said someone else had killed Vicky, though he didn't say who. In the months after Vicky was killed, it was claimed by an attorney that she had 3 videotape cassettes which allegedly showed a few of the high-ranking members of Reagan's administration in compromising acts with her, as well as other women. This was, of course, a rumor, but it fueled more rumors. One was that the timing of Vicky's death seemed just a bit too convenient. Perhaps as she was sinking into poverty, she threatened to release the videotapes unless someone paid for her silence. As well, it seemed a strange coincidence that Pancoast had moved in only 3 weeks before Vicky's death. Had he been paid to spy on her, or even to kill her? Or was he meant to find Vicky's tell-all memoir or the videotapes and get rid of them? After her death, her drawers had been rummaged through, and there was no sign of her memoir. There were also whispers that Vicky was actually killed by assassins sent by the government who wanted to destroy the videotapes. and Pancoast was just the fall guy. There was no real evidence for any of these rumors, but at the least, the assumption was that if Pancoast was guilty of Vicky's death, he hadn't acted completely alone. But who else was involved? That wasn't so clear. The year after her death, Marvin Pancoast was found guilty of Vicky's murder and sentenced to 26 years to life in prison. Only one chapter of Vicky's memoir was ever found, as she'd been working with another writer, and that was all they accomplished together. If there was more, it wasn't found. The alleged videotapes weren't ever uncovered. Was this because they were destroyed? We may never know. No one else was ever implicated in Vicky's death. In 1991, Marvin Pancoast died at the age of 42 while in the prison hospital at Chino. With him, the many rumors surrounding Vicky's death died too. Following today's theme of cases where everything isn't quite what it seems, I have a final case for you that will leave you questioning everything. On September 12, 2009, a family was getting together to visit a remote cemetery in the Appalachian region of Kentucky. The Hoskins Cemetery isn't easy to find, but the Weavers, in a convoy of vehicles, were determined to visit the graves of their relatives for a family reunion of sorts. After driving deep into the Daniel Boone National Forest, they arrived at the cemetery, only to find that the metal gate at the entrance was shut. Still feeling determined, they followed a dry creek bed around the gate and into the cemetery. Because of the difficulty they had getting inside, the Weavers were surprised when they saw a red pickup truck parked at the edge of a clearing ahead of them. However, nothing was more shocking than what they saw just beyond the truck: a naked man hanging motionless from a tree. The scene was horrifying. The hanging man was suspended from the tree by a nylon rope noose around his neck, but he was slumped forward at an angle, with his knees bent so his feet were still touching the ground. He was completely naked except for socks. Both his wrists and ankles were bound together with duct tape. There was a red rag shoved into his mouth, with more tape wrapped around it and around his head. Hanging from the tape near one of his ears was a U.S. Census Bureau ID card. His face was bloodied, with blood dried in one ear. It looked like he may have been bludgeoned before his death. And as disturbing as all of this was, it was made all the more horrific by the fact that 3 huge letters were written in black marker on his chest, reading "Fed." The family called 911 and a state trooper soon arrived. Running the license plate, the trooper found that the name on the truck matched the ID tag: 51-year-old William Sparkman Jr. William was living in London, Laurel County, where he worked as a teacher and as a census worker. 3 days before his body was found, William was reported as missing while working for the U.S. Census. William's death quickly made national headlines, but not just because of the bizarre and horrific scene of his death. Everyone focused on the word "Fed" written on his chest. Was it some kind of calling card? Had he been killed because of his association with the government, and his death was some kind of message? Speculation ran wild. William had been out collecting census information before he died. Was there a chance he had witnessed a crime? Could he have come across people who really didn't like strangers knocking on their doors and asking questions? Some thought that his death was tied to the fact that the FBI had a large presence in the area where he was killed. Others even alleged that William was a rat for the feds. This theory was fueled by the word "Fed" written on his chest. The preliminary report from the coroner said that William died from asphyxiation. The blood in his ear wasn't from a beating, but from an insect infestation. Even though the cause of death was determined, the manner of William's death was still a mystery. Was his death a homicide? Had he taken his own life? Or had it been an accident? Something like an autoerotic asphyxiation? Due to the strange circumstances surrounding the crime scene and the possible larger implications if William had been killed as a message to the government, investigators didn't want to rule anything out. 20-year-old Josh Sparkman, William's adopted son, became frustrated when the police continued investigating the death as a possible accident, and he thought it was disrespectful and dishonorable to consider that his father had taken his own life. Josh was sure that there was proof that his father had been killed, including the fact that his truck had been ransacked. William's census laptop, shoes, phone, gun, wallet, and a family wedding ring were all stolen from the truck. Strangely though, his clothes were left folded neatly in the bed of the truck. But the more investigators learned, the more perplexing the case became. There were many things that just didn't quite add up, including that the tape around William's ankles was tight, but the tape binding his wrists was loose and twisted. There wasn't any bruising around the tape, which meant he probably hadn't struggled when it was put on. He very well could have already been dead or was unconscious when the tape was secured. There weren't any other defensive wounds though, so perhaps he'd been drugged. As well, a piece of tape secured his glasses to his head, which seemed extremely odd. The clearing where he was found was almost completely undisturbed, except for the tracks from William's own truck, though more of the same rags as the one shoved into his mouth were found at the side of the clearing. Another strange thing was the fact that William's feet were still touching the ground, with his knees bent when he died, because if he would have just stood up, he may not have asphyxiated. And lastly, the tape, which should have caught the fingerprints of whoever bound William, was free of any fingerprints, meaning whoever had done it had been very careful and probably wearing gloves. One of the biggest clues was the word "fed" on William's chest. Something about it just wasn't quite right. There was a mark at the top of the letter E, like a bead of ink. This usually only happens at the end of a writing stroke, but most people wouldn't write an E from the bottom up, as it's more natural to write top down. That is, unless you're writing the letters upside down. This led investigators to suspect that William had written the word himself. Altogether, the weird evidence made sense. William's glasses had to be taped to his face because he wouldn't be able to do what he had planned if he couldn't see clearly. William had taken his own life, but staged the crime scene to look like an elaborate murder. Prior to his death, William had ditched his census laptop and gun and written "fed" on his own chest. When he got to the clearing in the secluded Clay County Cemetery, he rigged up the rope, stripped himself down to nothing but his socks, and then, while holding rags to hide his fingerprints, taped up his ankles, his glasses to his face, put a rag in his mouth, and taped it there, and then finally taped up his own wrists, which was loose because he did it himself. His DNA was later found on the rope and the rags that he threw to the side of the clearing after he secured the tape and before he hung himself by leaning forward on the rope and bending his knees. The big question is why? Why had William gone to such extreme lengths to stage his death? The answer isn't clear. William didn't leave a note behind explaining his actions because that would ruin the elaborate staging he had planned so thoroughly. Still, there's a few theories. One of William's friends told police that he'd talked about wanting to take his own life rather than have his cancer kill him. But if this was the reason, it didn't make any sense. William's doctors assured investigators that his cancer was in remission and there wasn't any reason to think it was back. Yet he had confided in his friend that he worried his cancer had returned. Some of his friends speculated that he struggled to accept his sexuality, while others said that he was suffering with financial problems. And this might be the key to it all. William's 2 life insurance policies, which Josh would benefit from, wouldn't be paid unless his death was ruled as an accident. He may have believed that his dramatic end was the only way to secure a financially stable future for his son. But even though he thought of every detail, in the end, it still didn't work, as the truth was revealed.